Hello, I'm Keith Johnson, Emeritus Professor of Linguistics and Language Education at the University of Lancaster. I thought I'd while away some of the time in this seemingly endless lockdown with a few short pieces about aspects of the history of the English language which particularly interest me. And I thought I'd begin with a word that actually we don't use very much nowadays. It's the word thou, and associated words, the words that go with it, like thee, thy, and thine. And I'm going to start with a story. It's a story about George Fox, who was a 17th century religious dissenter and one of the founders of Quakers, of the Quaker movement. Now, he used to travel around the country preaching his dissenting views, and very often he was met with opposition and sometimes even violence. I'm going to read a passage taken from his journal, and it describes what happened to him one December day. And by the way, throughout this video, I'm going to simplify the old language, modernize it to make it easier to understand. So here's the clip. And afterwards I passed through the country, and at night came to an inn, and I asked a maid if she had any meat, and if so, to bring me some. She acted strangely because I said thee and thou to her. I asked her if she had any milk, and she denied it. George Fox got nothing from the maid, and in the end he left, and, quote, he came to a haystack and lay in it all night in snow and rain, about 3 days before Christmas. What upset the maid was that he had used the thou form with her. In those days, it was used for intimacy, someone you knew particularly well, or for disrespect, someone that you looked down on in some way. And Fox paid the price for his linguistic inappropriateness. A cold, wet, hungry night in a haystack, just before Christmas too. Actually, Fox didn't mean either intimacy or disrespect. He was acting out of religious conviction. Like many dissenting religious leaders, he wanted to abolish hierarchies. It was the same spirit of egalitarianism that led to the Civil War and the removal of the monarchy. In linguistic terms, what this meant was, or what it suggested, was using thou with everyone, inferiors and superiors, intimates and strangers. The only time you would ever use you, in Fox's way of thinking, was in the plural, that is, when you were talking to more than one person. Interestingly, there are some similar spirits of egalitarianism in modern times. In the 1960s in Sweden, for example, there was something called the thou reform. That was when people, rather like George Fox, suggested that the Swedish equivalent of thou should be used with everyone. If you know a foreign language, you'll probably have come across something similar to the thou-you distinction. In French, it's tu and vous, and in German, it's du and sie, and it exists in many other languages as well. In fact, if you go back a little less than 100 years to Shakespeare in England, the time of Shakespeare and Elizabeth, you'll find that thou and you was used roughly as tu and vous in French and du and sie in German, although, as we'll see in a moment, there were some differences. Some of Shakespeare's characters used the wrong form as a way of insulting someone. For example, in Twelfth Night, Sir Toby Belch tries to goad Sir Angus Aguecheek into having an argument with Cesario. This is Belch's advice. If thou thou'st him some thrice, it shall not be amiss. In other words, call him thou a few times and that should provoke him. Using the wrong form was a way of being impolite. So when was it right to use the thou form? Well, it's a little more nuanced than use thou for familiarity and contempt. Let's start with the easy bit. Thou was definitely singular, so you didn't use it when you were talking to more than one person, even if you wanted to be intimate or even if you regarded them as contemptible. So everything I'm going to say from now on relates to the singular, and the issue that we're looking at is when was thou used and when was you used in the singular. There was a status or class element to it. Here's a table that shows roughly how this works. When a high status person was speaking to another high status person, that is high to high, you use you. When a high status person was speaking to a low status person, that is high to low, you used thou. When a low status person was speaking to a high status person, that is low to high, you used you. And when a low status person was speaking to another low status person, that is low to low, you could use either thou or you according to the situation. Let's look at these in turn. High to high, first of all. Let's take an example from Shakespeare's play Othello, where high status Othello uses you to his high status wife, Desdemona. What's interesting about that is that they're married and therefore intimate, but status seems to trump intimacy in this case. Turning now to high to low and low to high, let's look at a 1560s Durham court witness report. It's about an altercation between a Mr. Ratcliffe, who was a gentleman, and a Roger Doone, who was a poor man and who had been accused of theft. This is what the report says. And Doone said that he, Mr. Ratcliffe, should never be able to prove him, Doone, a thief. For although you are a gent and I am a poor man, Doone said, my honesty is as good as yours. And this is how Ratcliffe replied. What sayst thou? Said Mr. Ratcliffe then. Do you liken thy honesty to mine? At that point in the proceedings, Mr. Ratcliffe takes a swipe at Doone. So Ratcliffe to Doone is high to low, and Doone to Ratcliffe is low to high. I'm not going to discuss the low to low situation here. You can find either thou or you being used according to the relationship and even according to the situation. I said that the distinction between you and thou was rather like the French tu and vous and the German du and sie, but with differences. What were the differences? Well, one important one was that in many languages, the transition from you to thou was a meaningful one. It was a meaningful mark of growing intimacy, a rite of passage, you might say. A little like it used to be in Britain, changing from surname to first name, although nowadays, of course, first names are used much more from the beginning, so that no longer applies. Anyway, once you start using the to and do form, you tended to continue with it. In Renaissance England, the change was less stable and people were able to move backwards and forwards from one to the other. Let me give you an example from a letter written by Sir Thomas More to his daughter. Like Othello and Desdemona, Sir Thomas More uses you because of his daughter's status, even though they're closely related. Here's part of the letter. Your daughterly loving letter was and is, I faithfully assure you, inward comfort to me. So it's you and your in that part of the letter. But here's another point in the same letter. Surely, Meg, a fainter heart than thy frail father hath canst you not have? Why do we find thy forms used in this part of the letter? Perhaps it's because Moore is feeling particularly intimate with his daughter. Notice, by the way, that verb canst. It's actually the thou form of the verb, but Sir Thomas More is using it with you. It's as if he wants to use thou with his daughter, but he can't quite bring himself to do it. Anyway, it's fascinating watching Shakespeare's lovers switching backwards and forth between you and thou. Let's take a look at The Taming of the Shrew. That's the play in which Petruchio marries the shrew-like Kate, whom he tames. Towards the end of the play, there's a competition between the males to find out who's got the most obedient wife. The idea is that the three husbands send for their wives, ordering to stop immediately what they're doing and come running. The result is that the tamed Kate is the only wife to obey. Petruchio asks her where the other wives are, and notice that in this little piece of dialogue, both Kate and Petruchio are using the you forms. Kate says, "What is your will, sir, that you send for me?" And Petruchio replies, "Where is your sister and Hortensio's wife?" But then, a few lines further on, Petruchio asks Kate to tell the other wives to be more obedient. This is what he says: "Catherine, I charge thee, tell these headstrong women what duty they do owe their lords and husbands." Why is he using the thou form here? Perhaps he's feeling particularly affectionate at this moment because Catherine has obeyed him and won him the prize. On the other hand, perhaps he's lording it over her, using the superior form to the inferior. Anyway, the stormy relationship leads to many interesting changes in that play and in many others. There are many different reasons for changing from you to thou. We might say perhaps that Petruchio's use there is the affectionate thou. There's an angry thou too, that is, using thou when you're angry. There's a good example in the play Richard III, where two murderers go to the Duke of Clarence, who's in prison. The two murderers use thou with each other, and they use you to the Duke of Clarence, whom they're about to murder. That's all as it should be. But at a certain point, they get angry with the Duke, and they start using thou with him. "Who made thee then a bloody minister?" the first murderer says. Then they calm down, and it goes back to you. The second murderer's last words to the Duke are, "Look behind you, my lord," and then they murder him. Here's an example of a sardonic and contemptuous use of thou. It happens in 1603 when the high-status Sir Walter Raleigh is on trial for supporting Lord Cobham in a plot against James I. The Crown Prosecutor, Sir Edward Coke, accuses Raleigh, and he's very angry. "All that Lord Cobham did was by thy instigation," he says, "thou viper, for I thou thee, thou traitor." Notice that here he's using thou as a verb. "I thou thee," he says. There's a verb like that in French, it's tutoyer, and there's a verb like that in German, it's duzen, and it means to give the thou form. Even with these different types of thou, the affectionate thou, the angry thou, the contemptuous thou, it's sometimes difficult in Shakespeare and elsewhere to see any rhyme or reason in the use of thou, and this leads some scholars to believe that the distinction was dying out, that thou was losing its force. Die out is more or less what happened to thou. Today, we don't use it very much at all. You find it in a few fixed phrases like fare thee well or holier than thou. It's used in religious contexts, and it's also occasionally used in some traditional dialects. Here's a piece of advice which an elderly Yorkshire dialect speaker gives about building a dry stone wall. What he wants to say is, never just throw the stones down or you'll waste time. Here's what he actually says. Thou never throws them down. If thou dost, thou loses some time. And that's about it. I think it's a pity we've lost the distinction. I think that going backwards and forwards between thou and you was a way of expressing nuances in a relationship which unfortunately we've now lost. That's all I've got to say. I'm hoping to produce some more, so please keep your eyes open for a second instalment.